video or the hearing it on you.
I don't know if I can take this.
Nine to noon.
Sí, ahorita las 9, los tiene que ir a hacerse con intención.
Emily's mom. I lost.
Hello?
Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here right at 9. I did put a link in the Zoom or in the chat to a Google Sheet. If you want to click on it and get signed in, that would be great.
It's 9 o'clock and we will begin today's presentation. Good morning and a welcome to everyone for joining us today for the School Meals Training, Part 1. Next slide. A big welcome. Your presenters for today are the Nutrition Services Program Specialist. My name is Sean Vondracek. Erica Erder will be presenting, as well as Allie Lampman. And I've included information on the slide for the Nutrition Services website. This is where you will find information, resources, and forms presented throughout this morning's presentation. Next slide. Some housekeeping tips to keep in mind today. Please use the chat box to ask your questions. We will not be answering these questions during the presentation, but at the end of the presentation. But you can enter your questions in as you have them, but just be aware they will not be answered till the end of the presentation. And you will be muted during the presentation, but unmuted during the question and answer time. Next question, or next slide. More housekeeping tips. The slide deck and handouts have been emailed to you, and they will be posted on the Nutrition Services website. Please have your handout packet available as we go through the presentation, because we will be referring to it during the presentation. And the first page of the handout packet is your certificate, your training certificate for today. So next slide. So on the training certificate, we use the honor system. So today's presentation is from 9 to 12, and so you will be receiving 3 hours of professional standards training hours, and that is the number of CEUs that you're earning today. You do not have to have your SNA number. The SNA is an acronym for the School Nutrition Association. If you're a member of the association, you're assigned a ID number, and you do not have to be a member of the School Nutrition Association. You don't even have to put that number on your training certificate. But the training certificate serves as your documentation that you have obtained 3 hours of continuing education. So with that, next slide, Allie, is the training certificate that we just talked about. We use the honor system, and with the honor system, if you stay till the end, you receive 3 hours. If you decide to leave us early, please put the number of hours that you actually attended the training. And we encourage you to stay until the end for your success and hopefully less stress, because we will be covering a lot of information, a lot of important information that we don't want you to miss. Next slide. So what's our objectives for today? Well, the plan is that we want you to be able to plan lunch and breakfast menus that meet the USDA meal pattern requirements. We want you to be able to identify the required documentation for meal pattern contribution. So those are the 2 things we will be covering today. Next slide. So how does it all work? Well, school food authorities, and we use a lot of acronyms in the program, and school food authorities, the acronym is SFAs, must adhere to the rules and regulations of the school meals program in order to receive federal dollars. Nutrition services staff train on those rules and regulations, and then we conduct administrative reviews and procurement reviews to ensure compliance with the rules and regulations. So we're on a 5-year cycle that was extended 2 years because we were not in schools for 2 years because of COVID. And so we are actually in what's called a 7-year cycle because we didn't do reviews for 2 years. So if you have not had a recent review, you may be having one this upcoming school year. We will notify schools in the fall if they will be reviewed in school year 24-25. Next slide. We want to ensure that you have successful reviews, and we want to provide you with resources to help you accomplish that goal. So in your handout packet, we have key terms and definitions for the school meals program. So when a program specialist is talking with you, or even during this training, if you're not understanding a term, then please refer to that tool, the key terms and definitions, to help you. You can also just ask your program specialist what they are talking about at any time if something's unclear when you're having a discussion. We have also included the Nutrition Services Staff Directory. And on the directory, you will find information about our contact information for our main office, as well as our website address, and the program specialists that work not only in the school meals program, but also work in the summer food service program. So any of the program specialists listed on that handout, that directory, can assist you with any questions you have. And I encourage you to reach out either by email or phone if you have any questions. We also have included on that directory the staff that work in the CACFP program. And the CACFP program is the Child and Adult Care Food Program. We are housed in the same office, 2 separate programs. Financial Services is listed, our contact for financial services, as well as we have contact information for the food distribution program, which is administered through the Health and Human Service Agency. And so that contact information is also listed, as well as our state contact for food safety is listed on the directory. So if you're having any remodeling or new construction, you need to reach out to Alan in that office, because plans need to be approved prior to the start of remodel and construction by a food safety inspector. Next slide. In your packet, we've included another tool for your success, which is the Compliance Review Checklist. This is a new tool that we're making available. It is a self-review checklist that helps you understand what your responsibilities are in the program. Now, on the review checklist, it is divided into 2 areas. One is the administrative aspects of the program, and that would include determining eligibility for students that are free and reduced, as well as submitting the claim information. And then the second part of the compliance review is the food service aspects of the program that you would need to be responsible for. And so please use that tool. It's a great tool to use as you're checking to make sure that you are in compliance. And then the last tool that we've included in your handout packet is important dates. And there are specific dates that are important in the program. And so we've included that on that handout. to help guide you through what needs to happen when. Next slide. Some other important information you need to know for school year 24-25, meals are reimbursed by student eligibility, and that's the free, reduced, and paid. And USDA released this information in early July, and those rates are available on the Nutrition Services website under Quick Links on the home page. And then on the slide, we have what those current rates of reimbursement are. So how to interpret those rates of reimbursement for lunch, we see that the free rate of reimbursement is $4.43. Now, an additional layer of reimbursement is available to schools, and that is the performance-based incentive. And that is an additional 9 cents on top of the free, reduced, and paid rates of reimbursement. That additional layer of reimbursement, that additional 9 cents, has increased from previous years. When we first started with the performance-based incentive, it was 6 cents, then it went to 7 cents, then it went to 8 cents, and this upcoming school year, it increased to 9 cents. And that layer of reimbursement is for meeting all of the vegetable subgroups and whole grain rich requirements. It is a level of reimbursement that can be earned off if a school is not in compliance, and it takes quite a bit to get that turned back on if a school is found to be non-compliant. So wanted to explain that to you. We have at the top the breakfast rates of reimbursement, and then we have reimbursement for severe need breakfast. Severe need breakfast is an additional reimbursement available to schools that had over 40% participation in lunch the second preceding year. So it's just an additional reimbursement for those schools that have higher free and reduced rates of participation. Next slide. So what are some upcoming changes to the school nutrition standards and current flexibilities? This has been in the works for quite a while, and you probably have received information on upcoming changes to the school nutrition standards. And so I wanted to explain to you that the final rule titled Child Nutrition Programs Meal Pattern Consistent with the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans was published on April 25th of 24. And the goal of the final rule is to improve the nutritional quality of school meals. And rest assured, it is a phase-in approach to changes to the current meal pattern. Required changes will not begin until school year 25-26, with a phase-in approach through school year 27-28. So no required changes to the meal pattern for this upcoming school year. But there are added flexibilities that start July 1st. So those are already in place, and we will be talking about those flexibilities and the upcoming changes to the current meal pattern in today's presentation. In your handout packet, the timeline for implementation of each of the changes and added flexibilities is included in a handout. So that information is available to you. The timeline is very nice from USDA that explains what those changes are, when they happen, as well as those flexibilities that are in place as of July 1st. So let's go to the next slide, and we are going to jump in to the National School Lunch Meal Pattern. Next slide. To help explain this food-based meal pattern, it requires foods to be served from different food groups called components. And if you refer to your handout packet, you will see the lunch meal pattern. And we can identify the components, as well as this meal pattern requires portion sizes to be served to the specific grade groups. And the menus must meet not only meal pattern requirements, but they also must meet the USDA nutrient standards. So next slide. Let's refer to the meal pattern for lunch, and we can see that we have the food components listed, and those food components consist of fruit, vegetables, grains, meat alternate, and milk. So those are the 5 required food components. As we look across the page, we can see the required grade groups. So there is a required portion size for each of the 5 food components for grades K through 5, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12. And at the bottom of the page, we can see what those nutrient standards are for calories, saturated fat, and sodium. There's also footnotes listed on the page that explain each of the components a little bit more. And you need to always refer to the footnotes when you look at the different meal pattern requirements. That's where the specific information is found. So next slide. What are the required grade groups? K through 5, grades 6 through 8, grades 9 through 12. And then there is what we call an overlap between grades K through 8. So with that being said, as we look at the meal pattern requirements, we can see that for K through 8, the portion sizes are the same for 4 food components. One food component, which is the meat alternate, the weekly requirement for grades K through 5 is 8-ounce equivalent. For 6 through 8, the requirement is a 9-ounce equivalent per week. We will talk about this more on the next slide when we discuss the meat alternate. So as we look at the slide, we can see the daily requirement for K through 5 and 6 through 8 is a 1-ounce equivalent minimum per day. For grades 9 through 12, the daily requirement is a 2-ounce equivalent minimum of meat alternate. When we look at the weekly requirement, which is the 5-day week, we can see that the weekly requirement for K through 5 is 8 ounces per week and 9 ounces per week for our 6th through 8th grades. For 9 through 12, the requirement is 10-ounce equivalent per week. So we're required to serve 2-ounce equivalent at a minimum for our 9 through 12 grade to meet that 10-ounce per week. For our K through 8, we can meet that requirement by planning for the 9-ounce equivalent per week. So, for example, the daily is 1 ounce equivalent for K through 8. So if I would plan as an entree choice that students could have a 4-ounce container of yogurt, which is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate, that would meet the daily requirement. But if that was the entree choice that was offered every day for the 5 days, then it would only contribute 5 ounces of meat alternate, and I would not meet my weekly requirement. I would need to pair that with another meat alternate that contributes the 1 ounce so that I could meet my 9-ounce equivalent at the end of 5 days. So I could pair that with a cheese stick and offer 2-ounce equivalent per day. And then at the end of the 5-day week, I would have 10 ounces, which would meet my weekly requirement. Next slide. So, meat alternate must be served in the main dish or the main dish and one other menu item. So for the example I just gave with the 4-ounce container of yogurt, I have menued it also with 1 ounce of meat alternate for the cheese stick. For school food authorities, SFAs, not offering entree choices, the same form of meat should not be served more than 3 times per week. So if I am a school that is offering 1 entree choice to my students per day, I can't serve the same form of meat more than 3 times a week. So if I have chicken on the menu, the maximum chicken entree that I can serve would be no more than 3 times per week. Each entree choice must meet the daily required minimum portion size. If the entree choice is offered daily, it must also meet the weekly required portion size. So that was the example I gave with menuing the yogurt and cheese stick together. It would meet the weekly requirement for K through 8, which is a minimum of 9 ounces per week. Next slide. So what counts as meat alternate? Well, meat, poultry, seafood, cheese, yogurt, eggs, those are all credible meat alternate examples. Nuts and seeds can credit for the full portion size requirement, and that is a new flexibility that starts in school year 24-25. An example of a nut and seed would be like sunflower seeds, peanuts, those types of nuts and seeds. The next example is the bean, peas, and lentil group. And that is a name change from prior years that starts in school year 24-25. It used to be peas, beans, and legumes, and USDA renamed it to beans, peas, and lentils. They credit as a meat alternate or as a vegetable, but they cannot credit as both in the same meal. Tofu and soy yogurt. And then let's move to the next slide. So how do things contribute? We've went through examples. Now we went through those items that credit. Now, how do they credit? Cheese, a 1 ounce portion of cheese is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate. The dried beans, peas, and lentils, a 4th cup is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate. Cottage cheese, a 4th cup equals 1 ounce of meat alternate. Eggs, 1 large egg is equivalent to 2 ounces of meat alternate. Peanut butter, 2 tablespoons is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate. And then yogurt, a 4 fluid ounce or a half a cup is equivalent to 1 ounce of meat alternate. So what about non-creditable items such as bacon, canned chicken noodle soup, imitation cheese, commercial, non-commodity cheese sauces, or powdered mixes? Well, those items do not credit towards meeting meal pattern. They can be served periodically, but as we look at all the items that are listed as non-creditable, there's kind of a common theme with those items that they are higher in sodium and they add cost to your menus. And then they also affect the calorie content as well as the sodium. So their use in the menu planning should be very limited, but they can be served. Next slide. So let's talk about fruits. The fruit component. For K through 5 and 6 through 8th grades, the daily requirement is a half a cup. For 9 through 12, that requirement increases to 1 cup daily, needs to be offered for our high school students. We also have a weekly requirement for fruits. For K through 8, it is 2.5 cups, which is our half cup times our 5-day school week is our weekly requirement. And then for grades 9 through 12, the weekly requirement is 5 cups. So let's dive deeper into fruit. Next slide. So some information about fruit. It can be canned in juice or light syrup. 100% fruit juice can be served, but no more than half of the fruit offerings over the week may be in the form of juice. The next point is very important in that a 4th cup of dried fruit is equivalent to a half a cup of fruit. So if I wanted to serve a 4th cup of raisins, that would be equivalent to a half a cup of fruit. And the minimum serving size to credit is 1/8 of a cup. Next slide. So let's talk about those snack type fruit products, such as the leathers and the fruit shaped gummies. They do not credit towards a reimbursable meal. They do not credit towards the fruit requirement. USDA wants students to be able to recognize fruit in its natural form. These items may be eligible to be sold as a smart snack type item, but they do not credit towards meeting the fruit component in the lunch program. Next slide. Let's talk about vegetables. We have the daily requirement of 3/4 cup for K through 8. So the same portion size for both of those grade groups. And for 9 through 12, we have a 1 cup requirement that needs to be offered to our high school students. There's also the weekly requirements of 3 3/4 cup for K through 8 and the 5-cup minimum requirement for 9 through 12. And that is simply the daily required minimum portion size times the 5-day school week to come up with the weekly requirement. Next slide. Going back to our lunch meal pattern, let's take a deeper look into vegetables. So under vegetables, you will see the required vegetable subgroups. We have dark green, we have red orange, we have beans, peas, and lentils, and those are from the dry form. So we're talking about beans, peas, and lentils that were in the dry form and then taken to the cooked form. So canned black beans, canned kidney beans, navy beans, pinto beans, white beans, garbanzo beans. Those are all, they all fit in this category. They were dry, then reconstituted and canned. So that's what we're talking about in this vegetable subgroup. Now, I have seen green beans on menus where it was thought that they fit in this category. They do not. Either do green peas. They are not from the dry form. Those would fit under starchy for the peas and under other for the green beans. We're talking about those beans specific to beans, peas, and lentils specific to this group. The next vegetable subgroup is the starchy. And that would be the black-eyed peas that were not from the dried state, corn, peas, like our green peas, green lima beans, water chestnuts, and white potatoes. Those fit in the starchy vegetable subgroup. And then we have our other, which would be our green beans, cabbage, cauliflower, celery, cucumbers, green peppers, iceberg lettuce. They fit under the other category. And then we have an additional category called just any vegetable subgroup. But as we look across, we can see what the weekly required portion size is for each vegetable subgroup. So as we look across, we can see for grades K through 8 and 9 through 12, the weekly requirement for our dark green, which would be our broccoli, our romaine, our dark green leafy lettuces, kale, spinach, would all fall under dark green, and the weekly requirement is a half a cup. That's the minimum that has to be offered to all grades, K through 12. The next vegetable subgroup are red orange. Our red orange would encompass our baby carrots, our tomatoes, our sweet potatoes. The weekly requirement for K through 8 is 3/4 cup. So we have to plan that we are meeting the weekly requirement of 3/4 cup for our K through 8th grade students. And then for our 9 through 12, the weekly requirement for red orange is 1 1/4 cup has to be offered for our high school students. As we move on down to the beans, peas, and lentil subgroup, we can see that the weekly requirement is a half a cup minimum, needs to be offered for K through 12. So we have to plan for that on our menus. I know many schools utilize wonderful fruit vegetable bars and meet the daily and weekly requirements through offering a variety of different fruits and vegetables on their bars, and that's the easy way to meet the vegetable subgroup requirement. So having black beans, garbanzo beans, kidney beans on the bar meets the requirement. Students can serve themselves, but you are offering the required minimum portion sizes. The next vegetable subgroup is that starchy category, and the weekly minimum requirement is a half a cup per week for all grade groups. The other category, the catch-all for our cauliflower, celery, cucumbers, green beans, green peppers, iceberg lettuce, mushrooms, zucchini, is a half a cup for K through 8. And then 9 through 12, the requirement is 3/4 cup per week. Then if we look at the vegetable subgroups, we can see that excuse me, we can see that we're required to serve 3/4 cup per day for K through 8, which is a total of 3 3/4 cup per week. And if we add up the vegetable subgroups, then we still have that flexibility of offering additional to make that weekly requirement. For 9 through 12, the daily requirement is 1 cup needs to be offered daily for 9 through 12 to equal 5 cups per week minimum. And so we have flexibility to offer additional vegetables. Let's move to the next slide. And some must-knows about vegetables. Raw leafy salad greens credit at half the volume served. So 1 cup of romaine lettuce is equivalent to a half a cup of vegetable. It takes twice the volume for green leafy to credit. So for example, if I am standing at the end of the line where the meal count is being taken, where the cashier is identifying if the student has a half a cup of vegetable on their tray as they're leaving the fruit and vegetable bar, they would be looking for 1 cup of romaine lettuce, if that was the only vegetable taken, to be equivalent to a half a cup of vegetable. So remember when we talked about the fruit requirement, for dried fruit, it takes half the volume. So once again, a 4th cup of raisins is equivalent to a half a cup of fruit. Here in the vegetable category, 1 cup of romaine lettuce is equivalent to a half a cup of vegetable. Vegetable blends and mixes, for example, are California blend vegetables, which would be the combination of carrots, cauliflower, and broccoli. A 3/4 cup serving would provide a 4th cup of red, the red orange, a 4th cup of dark green with the broccoli, and then a 4th cup of other with the cauliflower. So that's how I credit a California blend. And then when we talk about our cooked dried beans, peas, and lentils, they may count as the meat alternate or as a vegetable, as we've mentioned earlier, but they cannot count as both. But a new flexibility is that they can count towards the required weekly vegetable subgroup portion size if served as a meat alternate. So that's an added flexibility for this that started July 1st. And then the next slide we have supporting traditional indigenous foods, and this is a new flexibility that began July 1st, and that for SFAs in schools that are tribally operated or operated by the Bureau of Indian Education and serve primarily American Indian or Alaskan Native participants, they have the flexibility to serve vegetables to meet the grain requirement. And also an added flexibility is that traditional indigenous foods may be served in school meals, and it encourages schools to serve traditional indigenous foods such as plants, berries, and certain meats. So added flexibility, and if you would refer to your timeline under flexibilities, it explains this these added flexibilities that start July 1st of 24. Next slide. So let's talk about fruit vegetable bars. I know many schools have fruit vegetable bars, and it's a great way to offer choices to students on different fruits and vegetables. And by offering a variety of choices, a student may find something that they like on those fruit vegetable bars, and they are more likely to eat those items. And so it increases customer satisfaction and consumption when students are able to choose what they like, so what they want to take. And of course, it helps meet those weekly subgroup requirements because we are offering those as choices to our students. So on the picture on the slide, we can see we have celery, baby carrots, we have broccoli, we have cauliflower, we have our cherry tomatoes, we have a romaine iceberg mix. So we are meeting the majority, except for our beans, peas, and lentils on those choices that are offered. But we could certainly add a container of garbanzo beans, pinto beans, black beans to our bar, and then we would be offering all of our vegetable subgroups. The only one we would not be offering would be our starchy. And starchy, typically I see on menus as potato products, corn or the green peas. And those are typically served hot. So let's move to the next slide. And so if you're a school that doesn't have a fruit vegetable bar, you're still encouraged to offer a variety of different fruits and vegetables to your students. And as we can see on the slide, there's many ways to do that by offering pre-cupped portions of different vegetables, different fruits for our students. This also increases customer satisfaction because students can choose what they want to take from a variety of different choices. So we have moved through the meat alternate and the fruits and vegetables. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erica to talk to you about grains.
Thanks, Sean. Hey everybody, it's Erica, and we are still on the lunch meal pattern. So if you're following along in your handouts, that is on page 24 of the PDF handout packet. I know some of you were asking what handout we were on. So we're in Zoom part 1 on page 24 of the handout packet on the lunch meal pattern. And we are going to continue on with the other components of the lunch meal pattern. First up, we're going to talk about grains. So grains are required to be offered at lunch meal service as described in the school lunch meal pattern. Ounce equivalents, or that OZ equivalent that we have listed on the slide, the ounce equivalent standards are used to designate the contribution a given serving size makes towards the grains component. Therefore, grain products served must be credited based on ounce equivalent standards. And an ounce equivalent is the amount of grain a product contains that is considered to or contains 1 ounce of grain creditable towards the grains component. Now, just like Sean was talking about with the meat alternate, we have both daily and weekly requirements for the grain components. So for grades K through 5, they must be served a 1 ounce equivalent minimum per day. Grades 6 through 8 must be served a 1 ounce equivalent minimum per day. And grades 9 through 12 must be served a 2 ounce equivalent minimum per day. In addition to having to meet both the daily and weekly requirements, so in addition to having to meet the daily requirements, you also need to meet the weekly requirements. So for grades K through 5, that would be 8 ounces equivalent per week, and 6 through 8, an 8 ounce equivalent per week. So you can see there's an overlap between grades K through 5 and 6 through 8. So both of those grades K through 8 need 1 ounce minimum per day and 8 ounces per week. And then grades 9 through 12 need more. So they need that 2 ounce equivalent per day and then 10 ounce equivalents per week. Now, just keep in mind for those grades K through 8, if you offer just the 1 ounce minimum daily, you would not, by the end of your 5-day week, meet your 8 ounce equivalent for the weekly requirements. So you either need to offer more minimum daily, or if you offer only that 1 ounce minimum on a particular day, then you'll need to offer more throughout the week to meet your weekly requirements. For grades 9 through 12, that makes sense, right? 2 ounce equivalent minimum per day. By the end of your 5-day week, you would have 10 ounce equivalents by the end of your 5-day week. Also keep in mind this applies to all entree options. So you have to meet both the daily and weekly requirements for any alternate entree options as well. So if you're offering an alternate entree that only credits as a 1 ounce equivalent, you would need to add an additional grain item to it in order to meet that weekly requirement. Next slide. In addition to the daily and weekly requirements for grains, you must offer at least 80% of the weekly grains offered in the school lunch and breakfast programs must be whole grain rich, meaning that a product contains at least 50% whole grains, and any remaining grain ingredients that are not whole grain must be enriched. This requirement applies to each program, the school lunch and the school breakfast program separately. So at breakfast, at least 80% of the grains you offer must be whole grain rich, and at lunch, at least 80% of the grains you offer must be whole grain rich. Next slide. The final rule maintains the current requirement that at least 80% of the grains offered each week in the school lunch and breakfast program must be whole grain based on ounce equivalents. Because this requirement is already in effect, you would not need to make any changes to your menus if you, from the previous school year. This was in effect last school year. So the whole grain requirement will help meet local and cultural preferences and allow schools to offer enriched grains such as white rice or non-whole grain rich tortillas, while still promoting whole grain rich foods throughout the school week. This requirement is a minimum standard, not a maximum, and schools may choose to increase whole grain rich offerings beyond the 80%. So if you want to offer 100% of your grain offerings throughout the week to be whole grain rich, you can do that. This is just a minimum requirement that 80%, at least 80% of the grains offered through the week must be whole grain rich. These changes reflect a practical and feasible way to work towards the dietary guidelines for Americans' recommendation to increase whole grain consumption. Next slide. The final rule also adds the definition of whole grain rich to the school meals program regulations. The definition already aligns with existing policy, and it states that whole grain rich is the term designated by Food and Nutrition Services to indicate that the grain component of a product is between 50 and 100% whole grain, with any remaining grains being enriched. Adding this definition to regulations does not change the meaning of whole grain rich that you have known in the past, and you can continue to identify whole grain rich products as has been described in current guidance. And we will go through how to do that coming up here on the next couple slides. Next slide. So in order for an item to be considered whole grain rich, there's 3 criteria that need to be met. The first one is that the product contains at least 50% whole grains by weight. This means that a whole grain, and that word whole is important, whole grain is the first ingredient, or if water is listed as the first ingredient, the second ingredient must be a whole grain. Any remaining grain ingredients are enriched. And number 3, any non-creditable grain ingredients are less than 2% of the product formula. So on your ingredient statement or your ingredient list, it's going to tell you, it'll say, enriched flour. And then the less than 2% is usually listed at the end of the ingredient statement. Next slide. You do need to have documentation on file to provide to us when we come to do an administrative review to show that the items you are serving are whole grain rich, and documentation that would be acceptable. Some examples, one would be the product ingredient list. So like we just talked about, a product ingredient list showing that at least that the first ingredient is a whole grain product. Number 2 would be a CN label, which provides meal pattern contribution information for commercially prepared combination food items containing grains. Number 3 would be a product formulation statement. So if a product does not have a CN label, you can request a product formulation statement from the manufacturer, which would tell you, 1, if the product is whole grain rich, and 2, how many ounce equivalents that product would credit for. The 4th documentation example would be a school recipe. So recipes are documentation that the grains included in the recipe are at least 50% or more whole grain. Number 5 is the FDA's whole grain health claim on the package. And number 6 is that the product contains at least 8 grams of whole grain per ounce equivalent. So it has a whole grain stamp on it saying that it contains at least 8 grams of whole grain per ounce equivalent. Typically, we see the first 4 provided as documentation. And we will go through some examples of those. Next slide. The first one is a product ingredient list or product ingredient label, and ingredients, you can see the ingredients listed. The first one says whole wheat flour. It has to have that word whole in front of it. It cannot just say wheat flour. So this product, a whole grain, is listed as the first ingredient because it says whole wheat flour. And then you can see the second grain ingredient is enriched. So it says enriched in front of it. Now, if these 2 were flipped around and the enriched wheat flour was listed first, this would not be a whole grain rich product, or we would not be able to determine that from this label. As long as the whole wheat flour is listed as first, then this item would be whole grain rich because it's listed as the #1 ingredient. Next slide. The next example is a child nutrition label or CN label. You've probably seen these on some of your commercially prepared or combination food items. It has that box around it with the CN on all 4 sides, and it gives you the ounce equivalent of grains. So we can see on this chicken stir-fry bowl, each 4.5 ounce chicken stir-fry bowl provides 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Next slide. We have an example of a product formulation statement coming up later in our labels section. So we're going to skip to the school recipe. School recipes are also documentation. The grains included in this recipe must indicate that 50% or more of the grain is whole grain. So we can see our school recipe for cornbread. We have the weight of the whole wheat flour and the whole grain cornmeal combined equals 1.5 pounds, which exceeds the weight of our enriched flour, which is 1 pound. So therefore, the cornbread made from this recipe is whole grain rich. Our 1.5 pounds of whole grains divided by 2.5 pounds of total grains in the product gives us 60%. So it shows us that more than 50% of the grain is a whole grain. Next slide. The last piece of documentation you could use is product information. So if it includes the FDA health claim, there's a couple different health claims listed there. If it includes one of those health claims, it would be a whole grain rich product. The other example is the whole grain stamp. So the first one would be 8 grams or more per serving whole grain. That would mean that the product is whole grain rich. If it has the 100% whole grain rich stamp, where 16 grams or more per serving, that would mean that that product is 100% whole grain. And you can also use any 100% whole grain items to meet your whole grain rich requirement as well. Next slide. We did want to touch on grain-based desserts. So you can credit a total of 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts per week. Just to keep in mind when you are offering these that you do need to consider those nutrient standards, which we will talk about coming up in a little bit. So they are going to still contribute to your calories, your fat, your sodium, and those kind of things. But you can still offer desserts. Everybody likes desserts. So at least a total of 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts can be credited per week, but just keep in mind that they do need to still fit into your menu and those nutrient standards. Next slide. When you're determining if at least 80% of the grains served are whole grain rich, there's a couple different options. So this first option would be a menu plan where we see that enriched grains are planned for a designated day in this example, on Friday. This is probably the easiest of the 2 options where you save that for just 1 day. So to determine whether you've met the 80% whole grain rich requirement, you would divide the total number of whole grain rich ounce equivalents by the total number of grains, so whole grain rich and enriched grain ounce equivalents for the week. So we can see on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, they offer 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich items for those 4 days. And then on Friday, they use their flexibility and offer just an enriched grain item that day, a 2 ounce equivalent of an enriched grain item. So if we do the math, we have 8 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich items for the week divided by 10 ounce equivalents of all grains offered for the week. So we would be meeting that 80% requirement that at least 80% of our grains are whole grain rich for the week. Next slide. The second option is a lunch menu where it has small amounts of enriched grains offered throughout the week. This option still meets the 80% whole grain rich requirement. And so on Monday, they have 2 ounces of whole grain rich items. Tuesday, they have offered 1 ounce equivalent of whole grain rich and 1 ounce equivalent of enriched. Wednesday, 2 ounce equivalent whole grain rich. Thursday, once again, they've offered a 1 ounce equivalent of whole grain rich and 1 ounce of enriched. And then Friday, 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich. So still meeting that 80% because at least our 8 ounces for the week are whole grain rich, and then divided by our 10 ounce equivalents for all grains for the week. So that would still give you 80% for the entire week. Okay, next slide. You have officially been with us for 1 hour now, so we are going to give you a 10-minute break to stand, stretch, step away from your computer if you need to. We will come back at 10:10 and resume with calculating grains. So we'll see you back at 10:10. Okay, I have 10 on my watch, so we are going to go ahead and get started with calculating grains. Before we do that, though, I am going to drop the Google sign-in sheet into the chat again. We just want to make sure that everyone is signing in on the Google sign-in sheet, and double check to be sure that you include all your information, your school information, and all the information that's requested on there so that we have it. It looks like we have about 160 participants on, and only 105 people have signed in on the Google sign-in sheet. So please make sure you sign in on the sign-in sheet. So up next, we're going to talk about calculating grain servings. Since you have daily and weekly grain requirements, it's important to know how to determine how a grain item contributes to meal pattern. I see that there were a couple questions in the chat asking if the daily and weekly requirements for grains were just for lunch, or if those could be combined with breakfast, and we are still those are still just for lunch. So we will talk about the breakfast to meal pattern coming up. So those daily and weekly requirements for grains that we just talked about were specific to the lunch meal pattern. Next slide. On page 26 of your handout packet, you have the grain breads chart. So this is the chart that's used to determine how a grain item contributes to meal pattern. It's divided into 9 different groups, groups A through I, listed down the left-hand column. So go ahead and pull it up, because we are going to talk about the grain breads chart a little bit. Grains are credited as ounce equivalents instead of servings, and the weight of the grain determines how much is required to be served. So that's why this grain breads chart can be helpful. Groups A through I are listed down the left-hand side, and the grain items are listed in the middle. In the next column is the portion size. So the portion size in ounces or grams that the items in Group A, Group B, Group C, etc. need to weigh to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So let's look at an example here. Everything in Group A, so the bread type coating, the breadsticks, the chow mein noodles, all of those need to weigh at least 0.8 ounces or 22 grams to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. And Group B, everything in Group B, the bagels, the batter type coating, biscuits, breads, hamburger and hot dog buns, so on and so forth down the list, need to weigh at least 1 ounce or 28 grams to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. Group C, everything in Group C needs to weigh 1.2 ounces or 34 grams to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. Now in Group C, if something weighs 0.9 ounces or 26 grams, it credits as a 3/4 ounce equivalent. If it weighs 0.6 ounces or 17 grams, it credits as a 1/2 ounce equivalent. And if it weighs 0.3 or 9 grams, it only credits as a 1/4 ounce equivalent. You'll notice as you compare the weights, as you go down the groups, so Group A, B, C, as you go down the list, the food items need to weigh more to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. And that's because you're adding more ingredients to these products. So other ingredients besides grains are being added to these products, and they need to weigh more to credit for that 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Let's look at a plain cookie in Group C. It needs to weigh at least 1.2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Whereas if you look at cookies with nuts, raisins, and chocolate chips in Group E, that cookie is going to need to weigh at least 2.4 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. Next, I want to draw your attention to Group H. For rice and pasta, at least half a cup of cooked rice or pasta credits as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So just remember, if that's your only grain for the day, grades 9 through 12 would either need a full 1 cup portion of rice or pasta to get their 2 ounce equivalents minimum for the day, or you would need to serve an additional grain in order to get to your 2 ounce equivalents of grains for grades 9 through 12. The other thing I wanted to say about this is you have to always round down to the nearest fourth grain, fourth ounce equivalent serving. So for example, we were just on group E looking at that cookie. If that cookie weighed two ounces, you wouldn't be able to credit it for 2 ounces. You would need to round down to the 3/4 ounce equivalent. So you have to always round down to the nearest 4th ounce equivalent if you're between weights on the chart. Next slide. So how do you calculate your ounce equivalent for your grain servings? First, you need to determine the weight of your product. You can either do that from your package information, the recipe information, or physically weigh the product on a food scale, and then refer to your USDA grain breads chart. Next slide. Using the package information, we have an example here of 100% whole wheat sandwich buns, and they weigh 2 ounces. So this whole wheat hamburger bun weighs 2 ounces, and we find hamburger buns in group B of our grain breads chart. And in order for a hamburger bun to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent, it needs to weigh at least 1 ounce. So our 2 ounce, so in this group, it's 1 for 1. So our 2 ounce hamburger bun is going to credit for 2 ounce equivalent of grains. Next slide. If you do not have that package information, you can weigh your item and compare it to the grain breads chart, just like we talked about, or you can weigh your product and do a little bit of math. Next slide. So if you need to do the math, the equation is the weight of your grain item divided by the weight equivalent to a 1 ounce equivalent from the appropriate grain breads group is going to equal the number of grain ounce equivalent grain servings. So the weight of your item divided by the weight equivalent to a 1 ounce serving on your grain breads chart is going to give you your number of grain servings in ounce equivalents. Next slide. So let's practice. We're going to do a little bit of a little activity here. So using your grain breads chart and a calculator or your phone calculator on your phone, you're going to, let's look at the grain items, determine which group they will be in and how many ounce equivalents they're going to credit for. So for tortilla chips, we have approximately 20 tortilla chips. Those are going to be in group B. And I can see that in group B, my item needs to weigh at least 1 ounce to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. I have 2 ounces of tortilla chips. So using that equation we just talked about, the weight of my grain item is 2 ounces divided by the weight equivalent to a 1 ounce equivalent serving in the grain breads chart is 1 ounce. So 2 ounces divided by 1 ounce is going to give me a 2 ounce equivalent of grain servings for my tortilla chips. Next up, we have a blueberry muffin, and I find blueberry muffins in group D, and I have a 1.5 ounce blueberry muffin. So if I take the weight of my item, 1.5 ounces, divided by the weight equivalent to a 1 ounce equivalent serving in group D, which is 2 ounces, 1.5 divided by 2 is going to give me 0.75 or 3/4 ounce equivalent of grains. So my 1.5 ounce blueberry muffin is going to credit for 0.75 ounce equivalents of grains. Let's look at a snickerdoodle cookie. I find plain cookies in group C, and my cookie weighs 1 ounce. And in group C, a cookie needs to weigh at least 1.2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So I take the portion size of my item, 1 ounce, divided by 1.2 ounces, and that gives me 0.833. I can't round up to a 1 ounce equivalent, so I have to round down to 0.75 ounce equivalents. So my snickerdoodle cookie, my 1 ounce snickerdoodle cookie, is going to credit for 0.75 ounce equivalents. Cooked pasta we talked about a little bit, so we find that one in group H. And if I have 1 cup of cooked pasta, I need, if I look at my grain bread chart, I need at least a 1/2 cup of cooked pasta to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So I take the weight of my grain item, or the portion size, in this case, 1 cup, divided by a 1/2 cup of cooked pasta, and that's going to give me 2. So my 1 cup of cooked pasta is going to credit for a 2 ounce equivalent of grains. In our last example here, a chocolate chip granola bar, I find chocolate chip granola bars in group E. And in order for something in group E to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent, it needs to weigh at least 2.4 ounces. So I take the weight of my item, which is 1 ounce, divided by the weight needed to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent, which in group E is 2.4 ounces. 1 divided by 2.4 is going to give me 0.416. Now I can't round up to a 1/2, so I'm going to have to round down to a 1/4 ounce equivalent. So my 1 ounce granola bar is only going to credit for 0.25 ounce equivalents of grains. Okay, moving on. Next slide. The last component we're going to talk about is the milk component. The minimum daily requirement for milk is 8 fluid ounces for grades K through 12. It does need to be fluid milk, and it must be served as a beverage. So what this means is you can't put milk in pudding or something like that and have it credit toward the milk requirement. Schools must offer at least 2 choices: unflavored milk, skim, or 1%, or you can offer flavored milk in the skim or 1% varieties. One of those options does need to be unflavored. Once again, this is a minimum requirement, so you can offer more than 2 choices if you want, but at least one of those does need to be unflavored. And then no other beverage, so juice or water, can be promoted as an alternate to milk. You do need to have water available, which we'll talk about coming up, but you can't promote it, say, do you want milk or water? So you can't promote it as an alternate to the milk. Next slide. The final rule continues to allow schools to offer fat-free and low-fat milk, flavored and unflavored, to grades K through 12 students at school lunch and breakfast. Schools may also sell these same milk options as a la carte. As a reminder, flavored milk offered at lunch and breakfast does need to meet the added sugar requirements by July 1st, 2025. And I think for the most part, most of the milks do already meet this requirement. And if they don't, then, manufacturers will be working to be sure that they do meet this. So, and that doesn't go into effect until next school year, where flavored milks need to meet the added sugar requirement of less than or equal to 10 grams of sugar. Next slide. Next in your handout packet is the fluid milk substitutions. So schools may offer a non-dairy beverage that meet the USDA criteria. If a substitution is offered, it does need to have the same nutritional content as cow's milk. And that's why we've given you that handout packet. We've given you the approved varieties that do meet the same nutritional content as cow's milk. So in order for it to do that, it has to have a certain amount of calcium, protein, vitamin A, D, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, riboflavin, and B12. There are unflavored and flavored options listed in your handout packet. If a student is lactose intolerant, it's not listed on here, but you can offer a lactose-free variety of milk that would also have the same nutritional content as cow's milk. It just doesn't have the lactose in it. So you can offer lactose-free milk as well. You cannot offer juice or water as a replacement. And if you need something outside of these milk substitutions, so you'll notice things like almond milk are not listed on here. If a doctor has ordered, a specific milk, such as almond milk, then you would need to have that medical statement on file to let you go outside of meal pattern. Next slide. There is also a water requirement. Plain drinking water must be available to students at no charge where meals are served. So this is breakfast, lunch, and snack, and cups are required to be available. So typically we see cups available at the POS station. The water can be, provided in a variety of different ways. So in a dispenser, some people walk around with a pitcher and cups. If you're a smaller school, that may work for you. If there's a water fountain available in the cafeteria, that is also acceptable, but you do still need to have those cups available either, in the kitchen or at the POS station where students can get cups as well for their water. Next slide. The final rule did clarify the potable water requirements, so it adds the word plain to the potable water regulations to clarify that schools are required to offer the plain potable water during meal service. Schools can choose to offer water with fruits, vegetables, and herbs added in addition to the plain water, but you do have to have just that plain water available as well. Next slide. Up next in your handout packet, page 30 of your handout packet, are the non-creditable menu items. So these are items that can be served to add variety or improve acceptability. But when you do this, you do want to consider the quantity and frequency of offering these items, as they are going to impact your nutrient content and increase your food cost. So some examples of these non-creditable menu items would be things like condiments, non-grain chips, so just plain potato chips or Funyuns or Cheetos, bacon, pudding, gelatin. Those are all non-creditable menu items. When we're thinking about these, we need to also consider, USDA always says to consider if it's reasonable and necessary to offer these. So if you're having, hamburger and French fry day and you're offering ketchup and mustard, then yes, obviously it would be reasonable and necessary to offer things like, ketchup and mustard, other condiments to put on your hamburger and to dip your French fries in. Now, is it reasonable and necessary to offer pudding and gelatin on your fruit and vegetable bar every day? The answer to that would be no, right? We're just increasing our nutrient content and increasing our food cost. Those do not contribute towards meal pattern, credit towards any of the components. So that would not be reasonable and necessary. Now, if you're occasionally having, a fun promotion day, then maybe that would be okay. It would just just depend on the situation, but it shouldn't be an everyday thing that you are doing that. On your creditable and non-creditable foods handout, it does go through list some other examples as well. So things like canned, powdered, or frozen cheese sauce, canned pasta sauce, frozen entrees, frozen pizzas or pizza sauce. Now, if those do not have a CN label, those are not creditable. So if you have a CN label or like the commodity cheese sauce or something like that, then it is creditable if you have a CN label that says how it credits, or a CN label or a product formulation statement. If you do not, if you've just, went to a store and bought this frozen pizza and you don't have that information, then you cannot credit it unless you have a CN label or product formulation statement on file. Next slide. Up next, we're going to go through a few examples. So crediting, the first thing we're going to talk about is crediting combination foods. The first one we're going to look at is a cheeseburger on a bun, and then we'll look at homemade lasagna. Next slide. In order to kind of interact with these slides, you can use your non-verbal reactions or annotate. And with the probably want to use annotate if you can. If you can't, you can give me a non-verbal reaction. But in order to get to that, if you're using annotate, you'll click on the view options button at the top of your screen and select annotate from the menu. Another bar will appear where you can select an interactive option on the screen. So like text, draw, or stamp. I like stamp, and that's probably going to work the best on these examples. So let's go to the next slide and I'll show you kind of what we have here. So the first one, we're going to say how this credits cheeseburger with a bun. If you go to your annotate option and put a stamp by each food component that this would credit for. So does a cheeseburger on a bun, would you be able to credit it for meat alternate, fruits, vegetables, grains, or milk? All right, looks like we have some people using those stamps. I'll give you just a few minutes to find that and mark on this. And if you can't get yours to work, that's fine. Okay, looks like we've got a few people to be able to use those annotate options. So for meat alternate, yes, a cheeseburger and a bun would credit for meat alternate. We would have our meat and our cheese. For fruits, nobody marked fruit, and that's correct. We would have no fruit on our cheeseburger with a bun. Our vegetables, no vegetables on a cheeseburger with a bun. Grain, yes, we have our whole grain rich bun, so we're going to credit that towards our grain component. And milk, no, we do not have any milk. Remember that cheese is going to credit as a meat alternate. It does not credit towards the fluid milk component. Okay, good. We're going to go to the next one. We have homemade lasagna. Go ahead and get out your annotate stampers and put a stamp by meat alternate, fruits, vegetables, grains, or milk if you think it credits towards any of those components. And once again, if you can't get it to work, that's okay. Just follow along. Okay, good. Let's go ahead and look at the answer here. We have meat alternate in our homemade lasagna. Yes, we would have our meat, maybe our ground beef, and cheese would credit towards meat alternate. Fruits, no, we don't have any fruits on our homemade lasagna. Vegetables, that one would actually be, it would be a maybe. It would depend on the sauce that you used. So if you have a CN labeled sauce or a product formulation for your sauce, if it's a canned sauce, then it would credit. But if you, or if you have a recipe that says how it credits, you would be able to do that. Otherwise, if it did not have a CN label, you wouldn't be able to credit that sauce. Grains. Yes, we have our whole grain rich lasagna noodles that we're using here, so it would credit towards the grain component. And what about fluid milk? No, we would have no fluid milk. So good, you guys all did a good job and it looked like you got those correct. So you've been following along. Up next, we are going to test your knowledge of meal pattern requirements, and it's not an actual test. So if you want to use your lunch meal pattern chart that was located back on page 24 of your handout packet, you can. That's why we gave you those handouts to use as, you know, as aids as you're planning your menus. Just to review again, those Zoom features on the next slide, we have the nonverbal reactions. So you can give me a thumbs up if you think yes, or thumbs down if you think no, or I don't know if there's a thumbs down, I guess. Thumbs up if yes, and then annotate down at if the view options. If you click on view options, it'll bring up that bar and you can use the stamper again. There's a place to put yes or no if you think that these meals meet meal pattern requirements. So let's go to the next slide and I'll show you what we're going to be doing. So we're looking at this meal. If you as the menu planner have met the meal pattern requirements. So this is not what the students are coming through the line at the POS on their tray with what's on their tray. This is what you have planned for the menu for the day. So we want to know if you've planned the full, all the components and all the required portion sizes. First, let's do for grades K through 8. So we have a whole grain rich corn dog. It credits it for a 2-ounce equivalent of grain and 2 ounces of meat alternate. A half a cup of crinkle cut French fries, a half a cup of corn, a half a cup of diced peaches, and 1 cup of milk. So does this one meet meal pattern requirements? Have you planned all the components in the required portion sizes for grades K through 8? So go ahead and use your annotate stamper to mark either yes or no. Or you can give me a thumbs up for yes in your reactions. Okay, I'm seeing lots of yeses, and I agree. This one for grades K through 8, yes, you've planned all the components in the required portion sizes. So let's clear this and let's do for grades 9 through 12. Have we planned all the required components in the portion sizes? All right, I see people marking here. Give you just a few seconds here to put your annotate on yes or no. And I'm getting lots of no's on this one, and I agree. So no for grades 9 through 12, because you as a menu planner need to offer at least 1 cup of fruit for grades 9 through 12. So grades 9 through 12 need to be offered at least 1 cup of fruit per day at lunch. Next slide. So our next one for grades K through 8, does this meet meal pattern? We have chicken nuggets, 2-ounce equivalent of grain and 2 ounces of meat alternate, a 1 ounce equivalent of whole grain rich bread, creamy whipped potatoes, a half a cup, mixed vegetables, a 1/4 a cup, chocolate chip cookie, credits for a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains, and 1 cup of milk. Have we planned everything for grades K through 8? Lots of people putting stamps on, and everybody has said no, that it does not. And that is correct. It does not. We are missing a whole component here. We're missing the fruit component. So of course, for grades 9 through 12, we're still going to be missing that fruit component. The other thing for grades 9 through 12, we are also short on the vegetable component. So we've only offered 3/4 cup of vegetables. And for grades 9 through 12, we need to offer 1 cup of vegetable for grades 9 through 12. So 2 things we're missing on grades 9 through 12. Next slide. Okay, for grades K through 8, we have nachos with meat and cheese. 1 serving equals a 1 ounce equivalent of grains and 2 ounces equivalents of meat alternate, a half a cup of corn, a half a cup of black beans, 1 apple, and a cup of milk. Does this meet meal pattern? Did you, as a menu planner, plan all the required components in the correct portion sizes? Okay, I'm seeing lots of yeses, and I agree. Yes, it meets the requirements for grades K through 8. Let's go ahead and clear those, and I want you to answer again for grades 9 through 12. Mostly no's on this one, and I agree. For grades 9 through 12, you're actually short on that grain requirement. So remember, daily grades 9 through 12 need a 2 ounce equivalent of grains and 2 ounces of meat alternate. So we only have 1 ounce equivalent of grains here. So we are short for grades 9 through 12. We have not planned enough grains to meet the daily requirement for grades 9 through 12. Good job. Last one, our next slide here. We have a sack lunch. So they're going on a field trip. We're providing a sack lunch. And in that sack lunch, we have a deli sandwich, baked chips, baby carrots, a fruit strip, and milk. So for grades K through 8, have we met the meal pattern for grades K through 8? Good, I'll give you a couple more seconds here and then we will move on. So I'm getting mostly no's on this one, and I agree. We're missing the fruit component. The fruit strip would not credit towards the fruit component. So we're missing fruit. And then the thing about field trips, so it's not going to meet requirements for K through 8 or 9 through 12. And the thing about field trips is there is no offer versus serve. So you have to send all components in the full portion sizes when you're sending a sack lunch for field trips. So you would need to send, your full fruit component, your full vegetable component. So for grades 9 through 12, you need to send a full cup of fruit and a full cup of vegetable in their sack lunch. And also don't forget to send milk. Sometimes I see people send juice in place of milk, and then you're missing your milk component. So send all components in their full portion sizes because there is no offer versus serve for field trips. And that's if you want to claim those meals for that day. Okay, great job, everybody. We are going to move on to the school breakfast meal pattern, and Allie's going to take over.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, so up next, we're going to switch and talk about school breakfast a little bit. So your next handout in your handout packet, if you're following along, is going to be your breakfast meal pattern chart. So you can take a look at that and reference the chart as I talk through breakfast a little bit here. As always, this chart's available in your handout packets, but if you need another copy, it's available on our website. The first thing you can see on the breakfast meal pattern chart is that grades are broken down by grade groups with daily and weekly requirements, which is also similar to the lunch meal pattern. But different at breakfast, there are only 3 required components. Grain, meat alternate component is now a combined component at breakfast. Another difference is that vegetables are not required at breakfast. So let's talk through each component that is required. So as I mentioned, there's a combined component this year. The grain and meet me alternate component has a 1 ounce equivalent daily requirement with additional weekly requirements. K through 5 is 7 ounces, 6 through 8 is 8 ounces, and 9 through 12 is 9 ounces. So if you were only to offer this daily requirement of 1 ounce, you would not meet the weekly requirements. Something to keep in mind as you're planning your menus. Fruit and or vegetable is a 1 cup daily requirement. Again, there is no requirement to offer vegetables at breakfast, but you can offer them and credit the vegetable towards your fruit requirements. Milk is 8 fluid ounces daily. And again, at a minimum, these 3 components must be offered, but more can be served. As you look at the chart, just like lunch, there are required grade groups, and there is overlap so that a single menu can be used for all grade groups at breakfast. A single K through 12 menu is, I would say, the most popular choice when serving breakfast. An overlap K through 12 menu, let's go through an example as you're looking at your chart of the grains. Remember, there is a daily minimum and a weekly requirement for each grade group. So if I was planning a K through 12 menu at breakfast, I would plan for a minimum of 9 grains for the week because this is the highest level of requirement for grades 9 through 12, 9 ounces per week. So to keep it simple, if you planned for 2 grains daily, you would be compliant for all grades with the daily and weekly requirements for the grain component. Before we move on, we'll review breakfast terminology because it's a little different than lunch. Breakfast menus are based on required meal components, but recognized as food items on the tray when determining a reimbursable breakfast. So again, a food component is a required food group that makes up the breakfast. Those were the combined grain and meet me alternate component, fruit and or vegetable, and milk. A food item is a specific food offered within the food components. So for example, 4 ounces of juice and half a cup of pears, these are the same fruit component, but they're recognized as 2 different food items on the tray. So why is this important to know? This is what makes up the breakfast meal. When planning your menu, you must offer a minimum of all 3 required food components, but the menu planner must also offer 4 food items. As a menu planner, you must understand this to meet the requirements for breakfast meal service. It is also important the cashier recognizes a reimbursable meal and needs to be trained for breakfast and lunch because the meals will credit different for breakfast than they do for lunch. This may require you to explain how items count towards food items at breakfast. For a breakfast to be reimbursable, at least 4 food items must be offered. A student must select 3 food items, including half a cup of fruit and or vegetable for the meal to be reimbursable under offer versus serve. So we've talked about the components required at breakfast. We've talked about the terminology, the components and the food items. Now we'll take a deeper dive and looking at how to count each component at breakfast. So when we look at grains, at breakfast, you can serve a double portion of the same grain item and it counts as 2 food items. I can serve 2 pieces of toast to count as 2 ounce servings and 2 food items. Or you can see on the screen, I can also serve a bagel that credits as 2 ounce servings, and this would also count as 2 food items. And now that we have the combined grain and meet me alternate component, the same would apply if you were serving a meet me alternate. So an example is a 2 ounce egg patty that credits as a 2 ounce serving. This would also count as 2 food items. Just a reminder, you're not required to change your current menus if you choose not to this year. You're not required to add the Meet Me alternate to your menu. This is simply flexibility to increase more protein-rich offerings at breakfast. Although dietary guidelines recommend including both grains and protein-rich foods in healthy eating patterns, and this flexibility may also meet the preference of your students. So let's look at that combined component one last time. So this component is now combined food component. You can serve either grains at breakfast, or you can serve Meet Me alternate at breakfast, or a combination of both Meet Me alternate and grains to meet the requirement. Again, it's a 1 ounce equivalent daily, but there are weekly requirements for each grade group. Remember that a week is equal to 5 days, and at least 80% of the grains offered at breakfast must be whole grain rich. So let's give you some examples of combining the Meet Me alternate and the grain together. I could serve 1 ounce grain, let's say it was a cereal, and a 1 ounce Meet Me alternate, let's say it was a yogurt, and that would credit as 2 ounce equivalent for the day. So I would be meeting my 2 ounce equivalent serving for the day. Or another example is it could be a breakfast sandwich. I have 1.5 ounce grain, let's say it's my biscuit. And on my biscuit, I have a 0.5 ounce Meet Me alternate, which is my turkey sausage. So the combination of the biscuit and the turkey sausage credits towards the 2 ounce for the day. When we look at the fruit component, juices must be 100% fruit juice, and no more than half of the fruit offered per week can come from juice. So this is easy when you plan for half a cup of juice and half a cup of fruit each day. Frozen varieties should not contain added sugar, and canned fruit should be packed in its own juice or light syrup. Remember, the daily requirement for fruit is 1 cup offering. So to help reduce plate waste, we recommend offering a variety of fruits and fruit juices daily. Plan for half cup portions and at least 2 different choices each day. For a reimbursable breakfast to be claimed, the student must have half a cup of fruit on their tray. So as the menu planner, you must allow the student to take a full cup if they want to. Again, another example, if you plan for half a cup of juice and half a cup of strawberries, the student could take both items, but the decision is up to you whether you allow them to take 2 juice boxes. Just keep in mind that no more than half of the fruit offerings during the week may come from in the form of juice. Currently, there are no requirements to serve vegetables at breakfast, but again, you can offer them this school year in place of a fruit or with a fruit to credit for the daily requirement. For school year 24-25 only, schools may offer any vegetable in place of fruit at breakfast with no subgroup variety requirements. You must still offer the required portion size of 1 cup daily. If you're going to add vegetables to your breakfast menu this year, just a heads up, starting in school year 25-26, schools that choose to offer vegetables at breakfast once a week may offer any vegetable, including a starchy vegetable. But schools that choose to offer vegetables at breakfast more than once a week will be required to meet at least 2 vegetable subgroups. So you wouldn't want to go adding that potato item to your menu this year, because you certainly could add potatoes to your breakfast menu and then next year have to take it off and meet the subgroup. So just caution you there. Certainly add vegetables if you want to. And again, you don't have to make any changes to your menus this year, but if you choose to serve vegetables at breakfast, they can credit towards your food component. For milk, the minimum daily requirement is 8 fluid ounces for all grades. Milk must be served as a beverage at breakfast. Schools must offer at least 2 choices. One offering must be unflavored milk, skim, or 1%, and you can certainly offer flavored milk, skim, or 1%. As we wrap up breakfast, some reminders: fruit and vegetable portion size to offer is 1 cup. At least 80% of grains offered weekly must be whole grain rich. A reimbursable breakfast must contain at least 3 food items, and 1 must be half a cup of fruit and or vegetable. We're going to use that annotate feature again. We're going to look at some planned breakfast menus to see if they meet the meal pattern requirements. So if you want to pull up your annotate again, like Erica showed us. We're looking at this tray, and again, you're the menu planner. So this is the menu that you're planning for breakfast that day. And we're looking to make sure it meets the breakfast meal pattern. So on our menu, we have 1 ounce equivalent of whole grain rich cereal. We have a 1 ounce equivalent of a whole grain rich graham cracker. We have half a cup of juice and 1 cup of milk. Does this meet the breakfast meal pattern requirements? And I'll give you a few seconds here to annotate. And I see most of you are marking no, which I would agree with. It does not meet the planned meal pattern requirements. You would need 1 cup of fruit offered, and we only have half a cup of juice offered in this planned meal. So correct. So let's move on to the next example. In this planned meal, we have 1 ounce equivalent of cereal again, whole grain rich. And we also added 2 ounce equivalent of meat me alternate, which is our egg patty and cheese. Looks like an omelet. We also have half a cup of juice, a fresh orange, and 1 cup milk. Does this meet the meal pattern requirements for planning a K through 12 menu? Yes, a lot of you are marking yes, and I agree with that. We've met the all 3 components in their full sizes, and we also have 4 food items. So this would be a good menu to plan, and it meets meal requirements. Very good. We have another one. 2 more. So in this menu, I'm planning 1 ounce equivalent of whole grain rich waffles. I'm going to serve scrambled eggs, which credit as 1.5 ounce meat alternate. I have a sausage patty, 0.5 ounce meat alternate, half a cup of juice, half a cup of strawberries, and 1 cup milk. Very good. This meets our breakfast meal pattern requirements for K through 12. Good job. Everybody's marking yes. And we have one last one. This one, we are serving scrambled eggs, which are equivalent to 2 ounce meat alternate. I have 1/2 cup of juice, 1/2 cup of apple, and 1 cup of milk. Does this meet the breakfast meal pattern requirements for a planned menu? Yeah, it does. You guys are marking yes. I have a few no's, but under the new flexibility this year with the combined meat me alternate and grain component, I'm not required to serve that grain at breakfast anymore. So I could serve the 2 ounce meat alternate scrambled eggs, and that would count towards my grain and meat alternate component, which is now combined. I am offering 1 cup of fruit, and I have my milk, and I have 4 food items. So I have the 3 components that are required, and I have 4 food items. So this one is a yes as well. Very good. Okay. So up next, I'm going to review nutrient standards. And then also in this section, we're going to review documentation to support meeting meal pattern. So your next handout, you have a USDA nutrient standards for breakfast and lunch chart. The nutrient standards are also listed on each meal pattern, the breakfast and the lunch meal pattern on the bottom, but this chart has all the information in one chart. So if you'd want to look at the chart as I talk through the standards a little bit, that will be helpful. So USDA has nutrient standards for breakfast and lunch that must be met as part of the meal pattern. There are weekly average requirements for calories, sodium, and saturated fat. So not only do you have to meet the meal pattern with the food components, you also have the nutrient standards that you have to meet. These standards are listed in this handout. So during an administrative review, we will have you complete something called the dietary assessment tool, which is used to evaluate the nutrient standards. It's not necessary to track the standards if you're not using a menu database system, but to ensure your menus stay within the standards, plan menus that follow the meal pattern, meeting minimum daily and weekly requirements for food components, utilize low sodium and reduced fat ingredients, and conduct any version of scratch cooking if possible. So as you can see in the chart, the first standard is calories. There is a minimum and maximum calorie level identified for each grade group. Calories values are averaged on the 5-day week, something to remember when you're making menu changes. These values are separate, so lunch and breakfast are separate values. And pay attention to things like condiment offerings and those extra items that don't count towards meal pattern requirements, but still add to your calories to the meal. The next item listed are the sodium standards. As you can see, the sodium standards are for the next 3 school years through school year 26-27. We are currently at a sodium limit of target 1A. Also a reminder, the sodium limits apply on average to lunches and breakfasts offered during the school week, and they apply to each program separately. The weekly limits allow flexibility for menu planners to occasionally offer higher sodium meals or menu items, provided they are balanced with lower sodium meals and menu items throughout the week. So again, these are weekly averages for both breakfast and lunch, broke down by grade group. And as we move on in the chart, you can see that meals cannot contain more than 10% of calories that come from saturated fat. Saturated fat comes most frequently from animal products, such as cheese, shortenings, fat and skin off meats, those sort of things. Remember, we just talked about increasing your meat alternate offerings at breakfast as an option. So best to opt for turkey sausage and light cheeses, those sort of things will help you meet this standard. Also, the fat-free and low-fat milk has helped the industry meet this guideline. So as we wrap up, some reminders on the nutrient standards. Make sure you follow meal pattern component requirements and portion sizes for grade groups, and you'll likely stay within the ranges of the nutrient standards. Be aware of those extra items that do not meet meal pattern requirements, but still add to the nutrient standards. Meals served over a 5-day week must meet specific nutrient and caloric standards. And items that are high in calories, fat, and sodium must be limited to ensure compliance with nutrient standards. And lastly, ensure your menus are supported by documentation of the product's nutritional value through things like nutritional fact labels, product specification sheets, CN labels, and standard recipes. And that is what we are going to talk about next. We're going to discuss menu documentation.
Thank you, Allie. I'm going to dive deeper into what documentation is required. And the menu, which demonstrates that meal pattern has been met with the food components. We're also going to be talking about what manufacturer information is required to support that meal pattern requirements has been met. We'll be talking about standardized recipes, food safety and HACCP records. And in our Zoom Part 2 training, we will go into depth about production records. So the menu tells us that we have planned for all food components to be served. On the calendar style type menu, we want to see all food components listed. For the manufacturer information, we're talking about nutrition facts, meal pattern contribution information, standardized recipes, which Allie will be covering. We'll discuss ingredients and instructions. And then food safety, of course, is our temperature logs and our standard operating procedures. And then, of course, our production records, which document that we've met meal pattern, we've planned for the correct portion sizes, and that we have prepared enough food for the number of meals that we're claiming for reimbursement. So let's start with planning the menu. Next slide. Well, you must meet meal pattern requirements. That includes if you are serving breakfast, then you need a menu that indicates all food components are provided to students for each grade group. For lunch, the same applies. And then for any program, other program that you participate in, which would be if you have a pre-K program, if you operate the after-school snack program. So planning the menu to ensure that you've met the food components that are required for each program you're participating in. So next slide, we're going to talk about the meal pattern check form, which is found on page 33 of your handout packet. On 33, you will find a blank template to assist you in planning your menus and ensuring that you've not only met the food components that are required for breakfast and lunch, but as well as the portion sizes that are required. We can see we have it for breakfast and lunch, and the vegetable subgroups that are required to be met weekly for lunch. And then on page 35, 33, 34 of your handout packet is an example of the completed menu pattern check for breakfast and lunch. Now, this is an optional tool for you, but it is a good tool to use to ensure that you are meeting meal pattern requirements. I highly suggest it for our new food service directors that are with us today, as well as our experienced directors. It is a required form. If you are having an administrative review, we require that this form be completed to demonstrate meal pattern has been met for the week of our observation during the review. So a very good form to utilize. And then let's go to the next slide, Allie. So what manufacturer information is required to be on file? Well, it's essentially all the support meal pattern requirements and nutrient content of the menus that are being planned. And so I like to think of this label that's on your screen as a gold standard label, because it provides me with the nutrition facts information. And I would need that nutrition facts information to determine the nutrient content of the item. We've just talked about that we need to monitor the amount of sodium that our menus contain for both breakfast and lunch. We need to be aware of the fat content, the saturated fat content. And we have calories that we need to be aware of. So we have our nutrition facts information on this label. We've got our ingredient statement that tells me the ingredients that are in the product. And I need this information not only if I have special diets and need to make meal accommodations, but also it is my proof that the product is actually a whole grain rich item. And then it also has CN labeling, that child nutrition labeling that the manufacturer has requested from USDA. And that is very distinct labeling with the rectangular box where I have CN in all of the sides of the rectangular box. And that tells me how one serving contributes to meeting meal pattern requirements. So this is an excellent label, but unfortunately not all of our labels look like this that we receive. I would put this on my copy machine and make a copy of it and put it in my binder so that I have that label available for every time that I serve this product. And it provides the documentation that we require during administrative review. So next slide. So product label information, we're talking about the ingredient statement, the nutrition facts label, the CN label. Well, I wish that all products, entree products, came CN labeled, but that is not the case because a manufacturer has to pay for that labeling. And so not all products are going to be CN labeled. But in the absence of a CN label, I can utilize what's called a product specification statement. And that statement we'll take a better look at on another slide, an example of what that looks like. But it needs to be on company letterhead. It needs to list the incredible ingredients, how that product, one serving, contributes to meeting meal pattern, and then it is signed by the manufacturer and dated. So those are the 4 types of product information labeling I need. So let's look at that ingredient statement on the next slide. Well, this is my whole grain chicken nuggets, and it tells me that the first ingredient for the breading is a whole wheat flour. So I know that it is a whole grain rich item, as Erica discussed when she talked about the information needed to identify if a product is whole grain rich. And as I've already mentioned, it's very important to have this label on hand. All of us are dealing with students that have food allergies or intolerances. And I need to ensure that student receives safe food. And so that would require me to read the ingredient label to ensure that product is safe for that student. Moving on to the next slide, our nutrition facts label identifies the amount of saturated fat in the product as well as the sodium content that I need to be aware of in the calories. And so when we talked about the nutrient standards, I need to know how that particular menu item fits in meeting those weekly requirements for sodium, saturated fat, as well as for my calories. Moving on to the next slide. We've talked about that gold standard, that child nutrition labeling. It gives me the product name, the ingredient statement, the CN logo is indicated, meal pattern, contribution. It gives me information about the product code, the authorization statement from the Food Nutrition Services, and then when it was approved, the net weight, company signature and the inspection legend. So it is a very complete label as far as indicating how that item contributes to meeting meal pattern. But once again, in the absence of that, we need that product specification statement. But let's take a closer look at the information in that box. It tells me the specific serving size. So for this example, a 4.5 ounce chicken stir fry bowl provides 1.5 ounce equivalent of meat, 1 ounce equivalent of grain, and then it indicates that it contributes a 4th cup of dark green vegetable, a 4th cup of red orange vegetable, and an 1/8 of a cup of other vegetable. So if I am planning a menu for 9 through 12 grade students, I know that this product contributes 1.5 ounce equivalent of meat, but my daily requirement is 2. It provides 1 ounce equivalent of grain, but I know my daily requirement is 2 ounce equivalent of grain. So this information tells me that I'm going to need to supplement the meat alternate and the grain in planning the menu. So important information that I need to have. The next label we want to look at is the product specification label. So in the absence of a child nutrition label, we need to request from our vendor before we purchase the item. Our first question should be, is the product CN labeled? The second question is, if it's not CN labeled, that you need the product specification sheet for the item. You need this information before you even purchase the item, because you need to know how it contributes to meeting meal pattern and how you can plan it on your menus. So the product specification sheet, once again, gives me the product name. This happens to be a chicken patty. The manufacturer is Chicken Company. It tells me that I get 158 servings per case. And then it provides me the ounces per raw portion of credible ingredient. So the raw portion per serving is 3.04 ounces of chicken. And then it provides me how it credits towards meeting meal pattern. So while it weighs 3.04 ounces, the credible amount is 2 ounces of meat alternate. It's signed by the manufacturer. It's dated, and then I have my contact information. So we need this information as we plan our menus so that we know how our products contribute to meeting meal pattern. So that's the required documentation that we would expect to have available. I often say, if you don't know how a product credits towards meeting meal pattern, there's no way the reviewer, when they're on site or requesting information, knows. So you have to plan your menus to meet meal pattern requirements. In the absence of meeting meal pattern requirements, those meals are not reimbursable. You need to have this documentation. It is a food program with required documentation. The first is that you have to meet meal pattern requirements and that you have to have the documentation to support that you've met meal pattern requirements. So let's move to the next topic, which Allie's going to be talking to you about recipes.
Thanks, Sean. So we've talked about crediting grains. We've talked about labeling. Sean just finished up with the labeling and how you can find a product label that tells you how to credit items. And so additionally, recipes are another form of creditation and how you can prove and calculate how your items are going to contribute to meal pattern. So in this section, we're specifically looking at standardized recipes. So a standardized recipe is a recipe that's been tried and tested in your facility, and it is tested for accuracy, which includes portion sizes, the crediting information, what the recipe, how much the recipe is yielding. A standardized recipe has also been adapted to your operation. So there's a quantity recipe, which is a recipe that serves 25 or more generally, but a quantity recipe is not a standardized recipe until you've adapted it to your operation. So it must be adapted to your operation because it might include different preparation methods. You may have different equipment at your location. So making sure that that recipe has been adapted, also adjusting those portion sizes and ingredients as you prefer. It also has the required meal pattern compliance and the nutrient standards on the recipe. At the bottom of this screen, we also have a link to the USDA Recipe Standardization Guide. This is a tool I highly recommend if you're standardizing your own recipes. As we talk through these steps, they also give helpful tips and step-by-step guides on how to standardize. It also has lots of useful tools in standardizing a recipe, like conversion charts and food definitions. There's also a section for student taste testing survey templates. So if you're creating a new recipe that you want to put on your menu and you're not quite sure if the students are going to like it and you want to have a taste testing, there is this little template that you can hand out with a sample of the item where the student can give you feedback. It's just a really great resource. So as we talk about standardizing recipes, another important thing that it gives you is portion control. And why would portion control be important? Well, it helps you understand the servings and the meal contribution, but it also can help you with your food costs. So as we see in this example on the screen, in my lasagna casserole, this recipe would yield 25 servings to meet the nutrient requirements. So I've standardized this recipe and we're cutting it into 25 servings. But let's say for some reason it was cut into 20 servings that day. You can see in our example that the cost would increase by 12 cents a serving, which would cost substantially more. So if similar mistakes are made every day on your menu and items like this were served, it would add up. The cost would really add up in your establishment without realizing it. Another reason it might cause plate waste. You know, serving too large of a portion to a student, they may not want that big of a piece. And then you would likely run out if you cut it into 20 servings instead of 25 servings. So portion control is a really big part of a standardized recipe. It helps you understand exactly the size to serve, the yield, and it also helps you understand the cost and keep that under control. So your first handout in your packet, we have a portion control handout, and this talks about, the items you're going to use, the utensils you're going to use in your recipes. We're going to be using things like scoops and dippers, which look like that ice cream disher. Also, we'll use ladles that have the level of measure on them, and we'll use things called spoodles, which is a portion server generally used in your fruit and veggie bars. Some are solid, some are slotted. So these measurements give you exact measurement levels, so you know exactly what is being served and that you're meeting meal pattern. Things you're not going to use are just a standard spoon, because that's not going to tell you how much of a portion that person is getting, that student is getting. So this handout will provide you with some guidance on that. Also, many of you may have the Basics at a Glance poster in your kitchens, or your menu planner might utilize this. They're available for free from the Institute of Child Nutrition, so you can order them from there as well if you don't have one or if you need a new one. But again, it gives you volume equivalents. It has some abbreviations on there, and it goes through those portion control measuring utensils. Very helpful. So we've talked about understanding what a standardized recipe is. We've talked a little bit about the importance of it, and anything that contains 2 or more ingredients is generally going to need a standardized recipe in your establishment. So creating this recipe again will save you time and energy and recording on your production record. It also ensures that every time the item is on the menu, it's the same high quality product with the accurate portion sizes, and it's meeting meal pattern contributions. All recipes should include ingredients and products used along with the instructions for preparing that, which we'll talk about here next. But as you look at the screen, we have a couple different examples of a lunch tray, and you can go through that and decide. Let's look at the first tray. So we have a cookie, and unless your cookie has a CN label that Sean talked about, or you're using the grain chart to figure the crediting, if you're not using those two items, then you would need a standardized recipe for that item. So that's a good example of something that would potentially require a standardized recipe. When we look at the apple, an apple wouldn't necessarily need a standardized recipe because it measures cup for cup. So I can measure the volume. It's one ingredient. It's just the apple. The same goes for the milk. We wouldn't need a standardized recipe for a milk because we know the volume because it's one ingredient. It measures cup for cup. When we look at the next item, we have a mixed vegetable medley on there. It looks like maybe cauliflower, some red pepper, broccoli. This item appears to be cooked. So for that reason, you would need a standardized recipe. You would need to know how to cook it. And then also for crediting the dark green and the red orange components of the vegetable, the sub-vegetable groups, you would also need a recipe. The same goes for a sandwich. So this looks like maybe a ham sandwich, but a peanut butter sandwich, a sub sandwich, anything like that, you would need a recipe. So this would be a recipe for one. So you would show what makes up the sandwich, 2 slices of bread, what amount of protein is going on that sandwich. And then you would also have in there how it contributes to meal pattern. When we look briefly at the second tray, again, we have that lasagna example. This, of course, would need a recipe. I need to know how to cook it. I need to know how to cut it. I need to know the ingredients that go into it that contribute to meal pattern. Your dinner roll might have a CN label, or you could potentially use your grain chart to figure the crediting on that dinner roll if it was like already cooked and maybe a frozen item that you thawed. If you were making the roll from scratch, again, you would need a standardized recipe if you were making in-house dinner rolls. Something like a side salad that I see next to the lasagna might be something that I got from the fruit and veggie bar, and of course would not need a standardized recipe because I'm choosing those items off the fruit and veggie bar. And then on our last tray, we go through a few examples. Of course, the corn is a single ingredient, and I mentioned that items containing 2 or more ingredients would need a recipe, but the corn is going to be heated. And so again, you're going to need to know what temperature to cook that to, what temperature to hold it at. So that would require a standardized recipe in that case. The same would go for your rice. You may get rice that's already cooked and frozen, but I would need to know in a standardized recipe the instructions on how to reheat it and what portion to serve. The fresh fruit, the strawberries and the cantaloupe likely came from our fruit and veggie bar, the same as the side salad. But something like the tacos that are in the last tray on the bottom, I would also need a standardized recipe. How many tacos are we serving? 1 or 2? That would depend on the grade group and the requirements. I would need to know the tortilla size for the recipe and the ingredients going into the taco. So these kind of give you examples. You look through the trays. You should be able to determine on your menu what is needing a standardized recipe and what is not. So the next handout I have 2 slides that correspond to the next handout. On the top part of the handout, it's information on the standardized recipe and what must be included in the standardized recipe. And then the bottom section of the handout I'm going to advance to the next slide and talk about that information. So in our example of our standardized recipe, today we're making chili, and you can see that in number 1, that is our recipe name, is chili. And in number 2, we have the number of servings, and you can see in this example, we have servings for 50, and we also have the recipe scaled for servings for 100. Number 3 going down is the ingredients in our recipe. We have ground beef, we have some seasonings, and then we have diced tomatoes, tomato paste, and we also have beans. Number 4 is off to the right-hand side on the picture, and that's our directions. So these are going to be the directions to make the recipe. Number 5 underneath the ingredients and directions, you'll see number 5, and this is the serving size. So for this recipe for chili, we have a serving size for elementary, which is 1/2 cup, and we have a serving size for secondary, which is 3/4 cup. Number 6 is below that, so we have a total yield for the recipe. So if we're making the 50 servings, we have 50 half cups. And you can see if we're making if we're doing 3/4 cup servings for that secondary group, we're getting 32 servings out of the recipe. Number 7 tells us the utensil that we're going to use. Again, it's that portion control measuring unit. So for the elementary, we have a 4-ounce ladle to get that 1/2 cup of serving. And for the secondary, we're using a 6-ounce ladle to get that 3/4 cup serving. Number 8 on the bottom, and really important, is our meal pattern contribution. So again, this is telling us how the chili on your menu is contributing to meal pattern. So for the elementary students, they're getting a 2-ounce meat alternate meal contribution, and they're also getting 3/8 cup of vegetable, which is coming from your tomato. And then you can see for secondary, because their portion was 3/4 cup larger, they're getting a 3-ounce meat alternate and a 1/2 cup of vegetable meal contribution. And then in the instructions, 2 optional areas. Number 7 on the directions, serving suggestions, add in a sprinkle of cheese and Fritos. That is just serving suggestions. It's optional because your recipe might not call for anything, any serving suggestions. And additionally, number 10, which is outlined in direction number 4 and 5, your recipe might not have any time and temperature directions. So it's required if the item does, but if you don't have a cook item, of course you wouldn't have number 10 in the recipe form. So these are all items that must be included on the standardized recipe. And as we look at the next example you have in your handout, the same information applies to our standardized recipe, but in this recipe, we're making a chef salad. So this would be a recipe for 1. So again, the serving is broke down by grade group. So we have the amount that goes in the chef salad for grades K through 8 to meet meal pattern, and we have the ingredients and the amounts that go into the 9 through 12 grade serving to meet meal pattern. This would also be true, I mentioned in the example, like for a sub sandwich. Another great addition to a standardized recipe, Erica talked about sack lunches earlier. Consider creating a standardized recipe for a sack lunch so that, remember, when you're doing a sack lunch, it's unitized meal. So offer versus serve is not an option. So a standardized recipe, and it includes everything that goes into that sack lunch to ensure that you're meeting meal pattern, would be another really good example. So the steps in standardizing a recipe, review your recipe carefully. Make sure you have read through everything. You're checking all the ingredients. You have the amounts included and the directions are detailed out. Make sure you prepare the recipe in small quantities. That's how you're going to test it and adjust it to your establishment. You want to weigh and measure the amount of product to be placed in each pan if that's appropriate. Determine the yield of the recipe. Again, the total yield, determining the serving size and your serving utensil. This will help you compute the number of servings the recipe will make. Evaluate the recipe, calculate the meal pattern contributions, retest if necessary. Oftentimes when you're standardizing a recipe, you'll get it to a point where you no longer need to test it, but only after several attempts of testing it in your facility. And then additionally, adding that additional information, that HACCP information, if it applies to the recipe. We also provided in your handouts a blank form. This is optional to use this form when making a standardized recipe, but it's very useful because it will ensure that you have all the required information on there. This is also available on our website and is a fillable form, or you could certainly take the handout and write on the recipe card and to create your standardized recipe. The next handout is a resource page that we've provided you. There are several places you can go to get standardized recipes, meaning they have the ingredients and the directions, the HACCP information and the meal contributions. Again, you would want to test them in your facility before making them for meal service. But it's not necessary for you to create the standardized recipes on your own. There's many resources available that have recipes already. So be sure to check that out. And of course, when it comes to recipes and your labels, even your special diet information, all the things that we've talked about today, how everything contributes to meal pattern, keep them organized in binders. We love to see those note cards that are, used and written on, but keep things in a binder, keep clear protective covers on them so that they stay nice and neat and clean. So that when we come on site, or even when your staff is looking for something, it's nice and organized and together, and you have easy access. Just keep in mind, if you're keeping any information on your computer, to make sure it's backed up. You would hate to lose all that information if it was only online. So just keeping it backed up as well, and keeping maybe a paper copy. In the last part of the recipe section, I do like to talk about the food buying guide. This is an essential resource for yield information and crediting information for a lot of the foods used in the child nutrition programs. In the food buying guide, you can find yield information for the common foods used. You can determine the program needs, and it will help you determine to correct the purchase amount needed. It will help you determine meal contributions and how food counts towards a meal pattern. Within the tool, you can create a favorites list. So if you're looking up items, you can add to your favorites list. You can create a raw recipe book. On the screen where you see the toolbar, or the toolbar home, meal components, food items, tools, appendixes. Under the tools item, there's also helpful tools to help you identify whole grain rich items. It will ask you a series of questions to help you identify if your product is whole grain rich, if you're still needing some help identifying that. Oftentimes a recipe might call for maybe, let's say, like ground beef that's already been cooked. And maybe as someone who is menu planning, you're not quite sure how much raw ground beef to purchase to make the cooked amount of ground beef. So the tool would help you with calculating things like that. Just very helpful resource in determining those yields and recipes. The site, you just go to their website. You'll need to sign up. It may ask you what type of establishment you're in, ask for an email and a password. And once you're into the guide, you have access to all the tools. USDA has trainings also within the tool to help you utilize the tool and explain how to use it. It is available in a web or a smartphone app. Oftentimes when we are in your schools for a review, or even just to help train someone, and we get questions on yields or crediting, we will pull it up on our iPhones and utilize the food buying guide as well. If you don't have access to the internet or you're not able to get into the food buying guide for some reason, we've also provided in the last handout for this section is the short form. So this has a variety of items listed on it. You can see the unit, the food purchased is in the first column. The purchase unit, meaning the size that you purchase it in, is in the next column, and then it's broke down by the unit per unit. So in this example, fruits is listed. This is a canned fruit. And let's say it's undrained. You're going to purchase it in a number 10 can. That's the large can that comes in the case of 6. And they're saying that there are 24 cups per can. So I might be a new food service director and I'm serving peaches twice this week, canned peaches, and I'm not sure if I need to order more. Well, I can tell by looking at this chart, utilizing this guide, that there's 24 servings per can. So I can calculate how many servings I have on hand approximately, and it will help me determine if I need to order more or not. And as you look through the sheet, it's 2 pages. So it doesn't have just canned fruits. It also has fresh vegetables. It has meats on it, protein items, cheeses, things like that. So this form is going to be commonly used items. For more details and more information, you can refer to the food buying guide. Okay, so that was wrapping up that section on recipes, and we're moving on and we're going to review HACCP. There are no handouts in this section, and it's a very brief section this year. Beth Haas, one of the program specialists in our department, is conducting food safety training this year. So hopefully I have a little bit of information on the last slide on that training, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail on HACCP training. So if you're still interested in HACCP information and want to learn more, reach out to us. We'll also have additional resources and trainings posted on our website at a later date. So HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. HACCP is a system that allows you to predict food risk, predict risk in food safety and prevent them before they happen. So by using HACCP, you no longer rely solely on routine inspections to spot potentially food safety hazards. So HACCP is a written plan, a food safety system that follows the flow of food from purchasing the food to receiving the food, storing, preparing, cooking the food, holding and cooling your food, reheating, and of course, at service. So things in your written plan, examples could be, this is where you're taking time and temp of your foods that you're cooking that day. You might be documenting that on your production record or on a HACCP form. These are going to be things like your temperature logs for your refrigerators and your freezers, receiving logs for when you're receiving potentially hazardous foods, the cooling and reheating logs, and then your standard operating procedures, also referred to as your SOPs in your HACCP manual. So HACCP is looking for any biological, chemical, or physical property that may cause a potential customer health risk, a hazard. And if each step of the process is carried out correctly, the end product will be safe food. HACCP is required to be implemented in all schools and all residential child care facilities. So it's a required program. Also, we like to mention that 2 safety inspections should occur annually, and you're required to publicly post your current food safety inspection report. The food safety inspections are not conducted by our department at Nutrition Services, but they're conducted by someone from the Department of Health and Human Services. So this inspection report is going to either be a yellow or pink slip that the health inspector gives you after they have been there. And this is required to be posted so that the public can see that. It's also required in your application every year to report to our department how many food safety inspections have occurred that year. So something to keep in mind. And as I promised, this section was very short in this training. Again, here are the Zoom trainings coming up that Beth is conducting her HACCP training this year. She has broke the Zoom training dates up into 3 dates, September 5th, September 11th, and September 18th. And each day she's covering a different topic of HACCP. She also had in-person training. I think one of them might be done already. But if you're interested in attending the in-person training, you can look at your contact list. We've provided you in your handouts, and you can email Beth Haas if you have any additional questions, or if you want to get signed up for the Zoom dates, reach out to Beth as well. So since there's a lot of new information this year, she's updated some of the forms. She wanted to conduct that training separately, but normally we would cover it a little bit more. But that is all I have, and we are to questions.
Thank you, Allie. Hey, I've been looking at the chat box, and we have quite a few questions in our chat box, and I believe they begin with the required vegetable subgroups. Does everyone have the required vegetable subgroups in their handouts? That would be on page 25 of your handout packet. We have the vegetable subgroups as well as what foods fit in each of the vegetable subgroups. That goes on to another question that says, do any canned items fall under the beans, peas, and lentil subgroup? For example, canned black beans or canned refried beans. Those fall under the bean, peas, and lentils vegetable subgroup. They are from the dry form, but they have been reconstituted and canned, and so they fall within the beans, peas, and lentils subgroup. And so with that, I think we had another question about beans, peas, and lentils. And the question was, what about baked beans or refried beans? And they are listed under that subgroup, beans, peas, and lentils, because they are from the dry form that have been reconstituted, and they would fall in that category as well. I am looking through. Erica?
They see, yeah, they wanted a refresher on the minimum required fruit and veggies for the daily requirement.
Okay, so we have daily requirements for the vegetables, which is 3/4 cup for grades K through 8. And then the required portion size to be offered for 9 through 12 is 1 cup. Underneath the vegetable daily requirement, we also have weekly requirements for the vegetable subgroups. So the weekly requirements were on the page 24 of your handout packet, which is the required vegetable subgroups. And as we look through the required vegetable subgroups, we can see what the weekly requirement is that we need to plan for grades K through 5, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12. So once again, we have to meet the daily requirement as well as the weekly vegetable subgroup requirements. Now for fruit, it is a 1/2 cup for grades K through 8 that we're required to plan for daily. And for grades 9 through 12, we have a 1 cup requirement daily.
And then a follow-up question to that is what they must have on their tray daily.
Well, we are talking right today about what you need to plan for on your menus. So you have to plan your menus to meet the meal pattern and required portion sizes. Tomorrow, we are going to talk about a serving option called offer versus serve, where we talk about what the student has to have on their tray for that meal to be claimed for reimbursement. So tomorrow we will go into depth about offer versus serve.
And I answered this question, I think, in my grain section. So the daily requirements, does this include breakfast as well, or is this just lunch only? So when we were talking about the daily requirements and the weekly requirements for grains and meat alternate, those were just for lunch. And then there was a separate section on the lunch meal pattern. And so each meal, breakfast and lunch, has their own set of requirements. And then, are fruits and vegetables interchangeable to meet daily requirements? In other words, can they have a half a cup of veggies and a half a cup of fruit on the tray and meet their daily requirements? And I'm not sure.
I think that goes back to
for
what I just said. We're
breakfast?
planning
Okay.
menus today. Okay, we're planning menus today. We have at lunch, we have 5 food components in required portion sizes for each grade group. We have to plan our menus to meet not only the daily, but the weekly requirement. Tomorrow, we are going to be talking more in depth about the offer versus serve option, which relates to identifying that reimbursable meal if the school utilizes offer versus serve.
And then for your daily menu requirements, is this combined with what you served at breakfast, such as could you offer 1 grain at breakfast and 1 grain at lunch? And the answer to that is no. Like I said, they are separate. So there's a meal pattern for lunch that you have to meet, and there's a meal pattern for breakfast that you have to meet. So the 2-ounce requirement for grains for grades 9 through 12, that's just for lunch.
The next question I see is True Moo an acceptable milk? True Moo is a brand of milk, and if True Moo is, if you're offering skim and low fat 1% milk, flavored or unflavored, you're meeting the requirements for offering milk in an 8-ounce carton of milk. Then we have, do you need a recipe for canned fruits? No. If you're opening a can of fruit, then you're going to be tracking the can size and how many cans that you have utilized. You're going to be indicating maybe if it's in light syrup or juice pack, but if you're just opening the number 10 can of fruit, you're going to be tracking what the fruit is, and you're going to be tracking how many that you have, which is in the production record section tomorrow. As far as the nutrition label, no. If it's canned fruit, if it's light syrup, if it's juice packed, you don't need to say the nutrition facts label because they're essentially identical by manufacturer. Now, if it's like baked beans, which would vary by manufacturer, we would want the labeling for baked beans, but for if you're opening a can of green beans, a can of corn, we do not need that information. They're essentially the same by manufacturer.
We missed one. It says, is a signed medical statement required for us to have to offer a milk alternative? And we will talk more about special diets tomorrow as well. But if if they are just requesting a milk alternative, we do have a request for meal accommodation form. And then, but if it is a signed medical statement, then you do have to provide the milk alternative. So if they just are requesting to have an alternative, then it's up to the school whether you want to provide it or not. If it's a signed medical statement, then you do have to provide that milk alternative.
I want to go back to labeling that's required. You would not need labeling for fresh fruits and vegetables. So we do not need labeling for fresh fruits and vegetables that would be on your bar. The exception might be the pack size. If you're serving something that is a fresh vegetable, we would want to have that information on if it's an individual packet, we would want to see the size of that individual packet, but that's more information that we're going to cover tomorrow on production records. And then this question is a great one. Tomatoes are a fruit. Why is it counted as a veggie? Well, in the school meal pattern, tomatoes are counted as a vegetable. And that may be because the normal person, you know, would recognize those as a vegetable, but they are counted as a veggie in the school meals pattern. And they would be a red-orange vegetable. So they would fall in that subgroup in the school meals pattern. I think we've talked about, do we need to have on file nutrition labels for all our fruits and veggies? No, we've talked about that if it's a particular to the brand, like the baked bean example I used, we would want that nutrition information for those types of items that are not like plain fruits and vegetables, but that would be like an exception. Amy talks about for the reimbursement rate for free. Is it $4.43 plus 2 cents plus 9 cents? That we talked about the free rate of reimbursement, and the base rate is $4.43 plus the 9 cents for the performance-based incentive. The additional 2 cents that Amy references is for schools that have over 60% participation in lunch for the second preceding year. So it would be for schools perhaps with a higher free and reduced population that have served, it's based on number of lunches served the second preceding year, is how that additional 2 cents is determined. So some schools may have that, probably the majority of our schools do not. And so the base rate is $4.43 plus that 9 cents for the performance-based incentive. Let's see.
Yeah. Grains for the day between breakfast and dinner. I'm not sure. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well,
I think we've already talked about they're separate. So there's a meal pattern for lunch and there's a meal pattern for breakfast, and they each have to be met individually. So you can't combine the two.
Jamie, you ask a question at breakfast, if they take an apple and apple juice, does that count as 2 items? And I believe it does not. That it's the same form of fruit and does not count as 2 items. So I'm sure you're offering a variety of different choices at breakfast. And if it's the same form, same kind, apple and apple juice, it does not credit as 2 separate items. Okay, so is True Moo an acceptable chocolate milk replacement? It is not on your fluid milk substitute list. Well, True Moo, I think, is just the brand. It is not, it is cow's milk. Yeah, from what what the labeling I see, it's just the brand of milk, and it is cow's milk, and it is not on the fluid milk substitution list because it's simply a brand of cow's milk. And then the next question, do you offer any training for Zoom, strictly POS? And tomorrow we're going to be talking extensively about offer versus serve and the point of service. That's what POS stands for, point of service meal counting. And the point of service meal counting is a super important topic because that is when the identification is made that the student is present and they have a reimbursable meal. And whoever is conducting your POS or cashiering needs to be able to identify what is a reimbursable meal as that student is counted and their meal is counted for reimbursement. We have a lot of handout material that's included in the handout packet that are resources for those individuals that are conducting your point of service meal count. It explains offer versus serve in detail.
The next question is, if we choose to list all components on our production sheet instead of making a standardized recipe, is this acceptable if I'm willing to do the extra documentation? And the answer to that is no. You would need both, actually, and we're going to talk about production records tomorrow. So on your production record, you are still going to have to list all components on your production record. If it has a school recipe, then you'll document it as school recipe, and we would want to go there and see that documentation as well for your recipe. Of course, your production record isn't going to include, cooking instructions or things like that. So the extra information, it wouldn't include, specific amounts of herbs and spices and things like that either. So your production record wouldn't. So you need both. You need your production record and your standardized recipe.
How do we find out if we have met the 60% requirement for the second preceding year? Does this show on our claim? I am thinking it shows on your application, but I need a refresher on applications to see where that information is, Amy, but I can reach out to you and let you know.
I agree. It's on the application, Sean, in CMP.
It is.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is too, where it indicates if you've met that 60% or not. It also indicates on the application if you've met the 40% for severe need breakfast.
Yes. Yeah.
What if we offer apple slices and apple and orange juice? How do we credit that? Well, the daily requirement for breakfast for your fruit is 1 cup. So you have to offer your students 1 cup. You're providing your students with 3 different choices, and I assume your apple and orange juice would be the half cup, and then the apple slices you would need to ensure were equivalent to a half a cup of fruit is how you would credit that. I'm sure you're making your students choose between apple and orange juice, or can they have both? Remember, juice can only credit for half of the requirement for fruit. Guys have asked super good questions, and we've kept you 5 minutes late. You are more than willing, or more than you may leave, is what I'm trying to say. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope to see you tomorrow for part 2. We'll stay on if you have additional questions, but the training is over, and thank you for your attention today and patience as we have explained the lunch and breakfast meal pattern and required documentation. If anyone has any questions, now would be an